A perspective for living. Bel Mooney talks to 6 people about the way a particular death affected their lives. Lord Hailsham remembers his first wife, Mary.
You've written about your life in your autobiography, A Sparrow's Flight, in a very open, even emotional way, Lord Hailsham. And you mark it seems to me, in terms of bereavements. This suggests that the great bereavements that you suffered in your life were as important to you as your achievements. Is that the case?
I think more important. They were personal. I never regard myself as having achieved anything. I've lived a very full, varied, interesting, and now very long life.
Well, we want to focus on the death of your wife in a riding accident in 1978. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the other bereavements, which may or may not, as we'll discover, have prepared you for Mary's death. Now, in May 1925, your mother died very suddenly. And you write in your autobiography, "I had no power to make amends." What did you mean by that?
Well, I suppose, of course, in the ordinary course of life, one loses one's parents at some time, but this was prematurely. I felt I had not sufficiently, I felt about all of them, that I feel guilt about all of them. And in the case of my mother, I thought I hadn't been sufficiently open in my affections. She had had a stroke 2 years before, and she had been very difficult afterwards, and I was a young boy of 17, and I suppose I was a little irritable, and she was difficult.
Write that after your mother's death, your father was, and I quote you, knocked sideways. Was the extent of his grief a shock to you, and did witnessing it enable you to be a little bit stronger, perhaps, when Edward died?
That was terrible, of course, because my half-brother, Edward Marchbanks, took his own life. And I can't tell you how awful that is when it happens in your family. No, it didn't at all help me over Edward. It was something quite different. But I was profoundly shocked because I was suffering very heavily myself from the loss of my mother. But the sight of his grief at the loss of his wife did shake me to the core. And of course I did help him. He wrote to me afterwards thanking me for the help I'd given him, but it wasn't enough.
And did you talk to him about your mother?
No, not much. It wasn't possible to talk to him about it. I mean, for years afterwards, literally years afterwards, one could hear him at night moaning with pain and grief. He didn't know that one could hear him, I think. He certainly was very audible. I was a little frightened, too, because when one's revered parent is in this state of mind, it is shocking for a very young person.
I'm interested to find out what you think up to that point you had learned from the experience of death. I also remember that you write that in the war, for instance, you had to break the news of the death of a beloved only child to a wonderful old man. Did your own experience equip you better for that?
I think every experience of pain and grief equips you to some extent to help other people. It helps in every case, and without exception, that people know that you really mind and share their grief, and that you sympathize with them in grief. That is a strengthening factor. But you can't console a parent for the loss of a child. You can only just love them.
Given that, did you feel, as you might also have done when your mother died, why? Did you cry out, why, to the universe?
No, you can't do that in a war. I mean, there was I there, but for the grace of God went I. There people were dying all round one, and one couldn't say why him rather than me, or why me rather than him, or why this one rather than that. War is not like that. That's what the Greek anthology man said. War does not spare the good man, but the knave.
So you accepted it as inevitable?
Well, it's inevitable, but the bullet has your name on it or it doesn't.
We come all the time to fate, and fate versus responsibility in a sense, which brings us to the death of your wife, because I want to explore both those issues. First, could you just tell the story of what happened when you went to Australia in the spring of 78?
Well, we went there at the invitation of political friends. I had to make a speech at Sydney University, and there was one thing they asked me before I went out, and that is there anything that your wife particularly likes? And I said, yes, horse riding, and so she did. And they said they'd arrange a horse riding episode in the tour, and so they did. We went round a big park in Sydney called the Centennial Park, which is rather like Rotten Row, only much larger. And then we trotted for about 10 minutes. My wife said, well, why don't we canter? They were all police horses, and there were 2 policemen, and she drew away, and I thought she was bored because I was going at a very considerably controlled hand canter, and she was letting her horse, as I thought, gallop, which it was doing. And she disappeared round the bend, and suddenly the policeman riding beside me, he said, which way shall we go? And I said, go on round the track, that's the way she's gone. But then I suddenly saw why he'd asked me, and I saw what I thought was a stationary car, because even then my eyesight wasn't perfect. I looked again and thought there was a car there, but there was a horse without a rider. And so I think, I said, we'll go straight on. And when I got there, she was lying in a pool of blood. She'd broken her skull on the back. And I knelt beside her, and she was right out, and she never recovered consciousness. At that time, I didn't think she was dying, or dead. She wasn't dead, because I felt her pulse, and it was going strongly. But she must have died on the way to hospital. And I got to the hospital, and nobody dared tell me for a long time. They kept me waiting for a very long time, and these nurses would come in, and I'd say, how is she? And they said, well, sister will be here in a moment. And eventually, somebody did come, and I said, I must know, is my wife alive? And they said, she's dead. So she was. So then I went in to see her. And there was a priest there who was very good.
You indicate in your book that you felt to blame for her death. Can you tell me why?
Well, I was to blame for her death in a simple way, because as we were packing, we were very short of space in the packing, and I very nearly said to her, why don't you pack your riding cap, which would have saved her, you see. Neither of us did, in the end, pack it. And I suppose we could have found room for it, but I didn't force the issue, and perhaps I should have done. I was to blame to that extent, but I don't regard it as a great sin or anything.
I was wondering, was it worse for you because you're a very distinguished figure that your grief had to be played out in the public eye, your private grief?
I don't think anyone avoids it by not being public, because one's life is public to a circle of people. Whether one is working in a factory or practicing medicine or whatever, your life is public. Obviously, I had to make up my mind about certain things. I mean, I could have retired into complete desolation by myself, but I chose deliberately the opposite course. And I went and saw Elwyn Jones, who was then Lord Chancellor, and I said, there's one thing you can do for me, and that is to give me some judicial work, which he did very kindly, and I've always been grateful to him ever since.
So work was therapeutic?
I think work is therapeutic, but it doesn't soften the pain, but it gives you something to do, and it gives you a sense of purpose, and it forces you to face the facts of life instead of mouldering away in solitary desolation.
Thinking back to what you said about your father and his terrible grief, was there any part of you which didn't want to be like that, which consciously wanted to handle it in a different way?
No, I suppose the fact that I had seen the extent of my father's grief made me realize that it was not a wholly uncommon experience. The fact that I had watched at close quarters somebody else's grief did, I think, enable me up to a point to see this thing in proportion. One's got to remember, you see, two things one's got to remember when one goes through an experience of that kind. One is that the pain of parting is the price you pay for love. It's a terribly high price, and the greater the love, the greater the pain. The only way of avoiding that pain would be not to love, and not to share a love. And therefore you've got to realize that, and be thankful for what you've had, which is this 34 years of devoted companionship and a common parenthood of charming, delightful children. That does, I think, enable you to retain a sane view. It doesn't mitigate the pain in any way, but it enables you to take a sane view of the situation in which you find yourself.
Were you able to say any of that to your children at the time?
No, they came to see me, of course, as I had to take her body back, in the same aircraft that I was travelling in, and they all met me at the airport, and of course we all went to the funeral and the memorial service in Hurstmonceux Church. But I didn't talk to them about it very much. They all suffered immensely. My youngest child was living with me at the time and was deeply affected, quite obviously.
What, if anything, gave you consolation?
I don't think there is a grief observed, and he describes exactly what I felt. His marriage was a totally different kind of marriage from mine, but he describes this coming up against the brick wall, the complete inability to penetrate the brick wall. You hammer on the bricks with our fists and nothing happens because there's no way through it. And he describes that exactly in a grief observed.
Is it at all helpful to feel that other people out there understand that they've been through the same thing?
Yes and no. I got literally hundreds of letters of sympathy because it was a very widely publicized event, and it was also a somewhat dramatic end. I think that the fact that people wrote so kindly does help, but the fact that other people are suffering the same thing may help you to console them in the same kind of way, because there are certain things you learn in the course of your experience. One thing you've got to realize is that grief is an illness. There's nothing to be ashamed about. One doesn't want to fight it. Tears are a natural safety valve. You don't want to say, I'm going to keep a stiff upper lip. You want to behave with dignity and restraint, of course, because you do want to behave like that. It's about the story.
Every year it's the same old story. You trudge through the crowded streets in such a course.
You've got to suffer it. And it's no good trying to pretend that your loved one is hovering somewhere behind your back, wishing you well. You mustn't indulge in fantasies. It is a terrible pain. And it goes on for a terribly long time.
I was going to ask you that, because isn't there a tendency